Hey guys, thanks for being here today. So what I'm going to show you is basically a couple of examples of the use of these physiological computing and physiological signals in the field of game user research and physiological adaptation. So special thanks for the Games Institute for inviting me, the Center of Bioengineering and Biotechnology, and the research lab in which I'm going to be working in the next months, hopefully. I'm designing myself. I will start like saying I consider myself as a researcher, and at the same time, I consider myself as a game designer. So, and in a sense, what those two guys are basically doing is to feel passion for one specific topic that includes games, and that I have been trying to do is research one specific field in the game user research, in this case for promoting health benefits. So I have been mostly working with serious games for health. So I came from this side, beautiful place, subtropical island in Portugal, on a volcanic island, also full of beautiful mountains. At the same time is the place of birth of the Cristiano Ronaldo, which is really famous in that island. So it's a nice place to visit. I'm not original from Portugal, but I did enjoy my place, my stay over there. We have an human-computer interaction institute. It's called Madera Interactive Technologies Institute, and which is pretty much aligned with the Carnegie Mellon University. It's a partnership between the Carnegie Mellon and Portugal. So we have a lot of ACI people and research in that specific institute. And I have been, in the past 4 years, I have been working in this specific research laboratory called neuro-rehab. And what we have been doing over there is basically games that are scientifically validated for health. So I have been designing like a couple of good examples of using this specific topic. And in my case, I'm specialized in the field of physiological computing. So for this presentation, I decided to have like 4 different topics or 4 different scenarios in which the physiological signals can be used in gaming and VR applications. So we can passively record the signals while one participant is actually interacting with the game. This is using physiological signals as a game user research. We can also visualize the signals in real time. This is classic biofeedback. But we can also use these physiological signals as a control input inside to any specific system. At the end, we can, beyond use this specific control input, we can also try to create intelligent adaptation based on physiological signals. So in this case, based on psychophysiological states, which are basically how we can explain psychological states based on physiological signals. And I like to understand, or I like to present this always from the very passive way to use physiological sensing to a very active way to use them at the same time as an intelligent adaptation inside the systems. Particularly in the field of biocybernetic adaptation, in this specific concept is called the Bio Cybernetic Loop. And for this construct, the idea is how can we use human body signals to actually augment the human-computer interaction. So how we can move from a passive recording of those physiological signals to actually something more active, more dynamic, more intelligent, and I like to say more humanized. So this is a technology that was pioneered back in NASA Langley in the 80s, more or less. And the idea was while the pilots were like, piloting the ship, how can we use electroencephalographic signals in real time to reduce the fatigue levels of users while they are like interacting with the user board, like a lot of buttons and user interface that they have in front of them. So, and European Governance Challenge in the 21st century was like a very interesting meeting for different specialists in bioengineering in Europe. They defined 3 specific fields in which this Bio Cybernetic Loop can be really or extremely helpful, and they define specific examples for the health, games, and learning fields. But once we move to the real, to the kind of like real scenarios, the research laboratory, we will see that the science fiction sometimes is like far away from what is happening like in real life. So we have a lot of sensors, really cumbersome setups, like really invasive, uncomfortable sensors, and we have a very a mismatch between what is expecting, like, you know, you can only just put a sensor and believe that the sensor will interpret like a bunch of things from you, but the bad news here is you have to make a lot of processing in order to transform this raw data in useful information. So interestingly, I believe that the games are a very nice and probably the best medium for training this physiological regulation or self-regulation skills. So how can we actually control our inner states, or how can we adjust these physiological responses that we are having? So I do believe that the games are a very extraordinary medium for this specific training, and it has been shown that once you can regulate your physiological responses, there are like several health benefits that are associated with that specific fact. So what I'm going to be doing is basically, showing you the different examples of using these signals as a way to study people while interacting with games, users. Not so much in biofeedback because it's not my specialty. Then I will move as a control input, and at the end I will show you a couple of examples of how we've been using this as a biocybernetic adaptation strategy. So I started my PhD working with Exergames. So and here the idea is to use the movement as an input inside the games. So specifically, I was working with older adults, and very much an agenda in this specific field is, okay, how can we balance the fun, the fact that the games are already fun, but also how can we promote health benefits on it? So how can we improve also the personalization for different types of users and impairments, and how can we develop strategies to provide a better adaptation to it? It was working through a user-centered design process or like strategy in the human-computer interaction field. And I was also interested in join or match these physiological computing principles. To start, we have made a kind of a very simplistic adaptation of the Pong game. And we started like studying how this game can be used as a way to promote exercise in older adults. And I was using a couple of sensors to actually record user responses during the interaction with this specific game. And we compared the Exergames, so the active way to play the game, versus the conventional or like, you know, the hand controller, the handheld controller version of the game. So I was like kind of recording that. And the main idea in this study was, okay, you're gonna try to investigate how can we modulate specific game parameters and how this modulation can actually be measured in physiological responses from users, for instance, in the heart rate and heart rate variability. So how small changes in some specific parameters in the game can produce the physiological responses that we want to see. We were also interested in seeing like a type of feedback, like do the rewards or the punishments are those like beneficial for the improved experience, or to change a little bit the physiological responses. And that we showed in this specific study is there is actually a way to modulate in a very fine way the game parameters to produce very interesting cardiovascular responses on users. So there is a way to create this specific modulation. So this is not a closed loop system, but this is a kind of a good example of how you can use physiological sensors to better understand the physiological responses during an exergaming experience. I was also interested in measure the physical activity and how to quantify the physical activity. It was using actigraphy, and here the idea is how can we use the accelerometers and to actually predict how well are people exercising during this specific interaction with the games. In this specific process, we took like 2 years to develop this year in a very iterative process.
Several types of different games that are targeting different functionalities in the fitness domain, such as cardiorespiratory, musculoskeletal, and balance. So we are actually applying this type of Exergames in a training program in a senior local gymnasium here in Funchal. In a sense, we are using body tracking technology, and they are playing in this fluid projection. They have to move, they have to carry out different lateral movements, they have to, for instance, row in a virtual boat. They are basically immersed in a Portuguese virtual tour that covers different traditional activities here in Portugal. So they are normally playing this set of games, kind of like a mini games, but at the same time they are making exercise. And we are trying to fit our Exergames to what is recommended for this specific senior population.
So a set of 4 games that we developed specifically designed for the Portuguese older adults. They were pretty familiar with the activities, so they, the Portuguese society is pretty much based on the wine culture. So they have been harvesting grapes like during centuries ago. So we were like brainstorming different ideas with older adults, with therapists, with game designers and games for health experts, and trying to, how can we actually combine different game mechanics by using this fluid projection setup, and how can we create a kind of an enjoyable training program for them. So we came out with all of these different 4 Exergames, you know, rowing in the boat, like trying to carry the barrels for the transporting the wine, like making the wine while you are actually stepping. This is a very kind of like interesting touristic attraction in Madera. You are actually going down in these ledges, like cars, small cars, and people are going like 30 to 40 kilometers per hour. So it's like a pretty unique experience, and we were like gamifying that. So after 3 months control intervention, we actually compared the Exergames, like people playing the Exergames during that was like 2 times per week, and we saw how the Exergaming condition can actually elicit a very specific response in terms of the physical activity. So if we saw like during the 24 sessions more or less along these 3 months, so we can see that the Exergames are very much similar, and some days better in terms of the physical activity responses. This is the moderate to vigorous physical activity that they can actually exert during this specific exercise. So they are not only fun, but they also can produce measurable and very recommended physical activity patterns for this specific older population. The last idea with this specific games was trying to use some robots that they have designed in the Universidade de Lisboa. And the idea was how the robot can actually encourage the older adults to keep their motivation, or how can the robot serve as a way to provide feedback or auditory feedback for them, and how these 2 different platforms can be connected in order to push users to exert in different manners and in different scenarios. So that was some possible scenario, and they are like trying to run a couple of studies with this setup of kind of like robot encouraging older adults to promote this exercise. This is mostly in the field of Exergames. And before finishing my PhD, I was challenged by a US company to use this specific technology, physiological sensing, and biocybernetic adaptation to create this virtual reality simulation for military training. So the main idea here was, okay, how can we use bioadaptive systems? How can we merge this with the virtual reality training? And how can we produce a specific cognitive enhancement in terms of the training that we will produce? For that, we will using two different sensors, a wearable brain-computer interface and some wearable chest strap sensors as well. And this was kind of the psychophysiological state that we were targeting. It's called concentrated, calm, and collected. So it seems like once you are like about of, shooting your weapons, if you can keep good breathing pace or a good breathing rhythm, and at the same time be concentrated, you can possibly avoid some risks and mistakes that you can commit while shooting. So we would like to push the militaries, in this case police officers, to be in this specific state. For that, we run a study, around 10, 12 participants, and we were using state-of-the-art VR headsets. We were using the Muñoz BCI headband. It's a wearable brain-computer interface located mostly in the frontal. We were using the chest strap sensor for the heart rate and heart rate variability data. And the idea was trying to make an initial characterization, like physiological characterization of users during this shooting scenario, virtual shooting scenario. After having them interacting with the system, we came out with this psychophysiological model. How does it work is basically like this. We have different metrics, one for the concentration and one for the calmness. So we have cardiovascular measurements for the calmness and the neurophysiological measurements for the concentration. So, and then we were modulating manually or triggering manually the difficulty of the simulation. So we took a baseline, and in a sense, the heart rate data has a kind of an average behavior of these participants was like this. So we were increasing the difficulty in the virtual scenario, and the heart rate was also increasing. And something similar was also happening for the neurophysiological data collected from the wearable brain-computer interface. And we detected this as our target zone, in which we actually saw that people had more headshots in the virtual training scenario. So this model was pretty useful to move to the closed loop system, to the real-time system, the system that is capable to adapt to modulate the simulation variables in real time by using the physiological sensing. So this is kind of the first step before going to the real-time system, is to make a kind of a clear model of how the system will act and how the responses will be. Later in this presentation, I will show you the last example of the bio cybernetic adaptation in this specific system. So these are some of the projects in which I have been actually and actively using physiological signals to actually record the responses of users while interacting with games and virtual reality simulations. But you can also use those physiological signals in a little bit more active way. So you can use them as a control as a control input into your system. For that, I started back in my original country, which is Colombia, and we started thinking, how can we actually go to a rehabilitation center, and how can we assist that rehabilitation center by means of using serious games. So we started a development process, and we came out with a kind of something organically interesting with the clinicians in Colombia. So they gave us a space in the rehabilitation center, And we, while they were doing the conventional therapies in the different spaces that they have, we were also like testing different games that we were developing. So the developing team they actually have an office in the rehabilitation center. So that was kind of like simple and useful as well to create iterative process with them. So we were testing different technologies, different game concepts. Like we were receiving the feedback from the older adults and the clinicians at the same time. So they were always like assisted by therapists. So and we developed like a set of games that were like targeting different impairments and different rehabilitation therapies that they were needing. We were also developing this game for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We were using again some wearable brain-computer interfaces for that because at that moment that was probably the easiest way to start developing something. And here, if you can see, if they get the threshold of that specific concentration level, they can like activate specific things into the game. So they are playing with the gamepad, but at the same time, they are using the ability to have a good concentration level to unlock things in those specific games. So we're developing like a whole set of games that that were like organically working with the other conventional therapies that the therapists were carrying out at that specific rehabilitation center. We got an award for this from the MIT Technology Review in Colombia, and that was like very encouraging because we actually managed to make this in a very synergical way, like clinicians, the game studios that were participating, and the researchers in the rehabilitation center. That was interesting, but at the same time, we got like a lot of troubles with the wearable sensors because although they are like comfortable and minimal invasive, they are also inaccurate in most of the cases. And in the lab, you can probably work with better technology, sometimes more cumbersome, sometimes more invasive, but also more accurate. So I was also working on how to use brain-computer interfaces and one specific paradigm or interaction paradigm called motor imagery, in which you are actually imagining the movement of specific limbs, in this case upper limbs, right hand or left hand, and how can you measure that movement intention and use it as an input into the system. So in this case, we were exploring a paradigm called motor priming, in which we include the live motion sensor, which is basically a sensor to carry out like hand gesture detection. And we asked people to carry out the physical movement, like real movement, before the imagination. So our main hypothesis here was by doing this, people will have a vivid imagery of those specific movements, and they will have probably a better interaction with this multimodal virtual reality interface. So at the very beginning, they were they were performing the real movement, but then they were going through the whole training process, and at the end, they were imagining the same movement. And we were using this to feed a very specific virtual reality task and opening a garage door. So again, a little bit more cumbersome setup, more invasive sensors, but at the same time, more accurate. So we were using this. So people were first doing the movement, then they were training the same movement by just doing the imagination, the motor imagery part, and then we were allowing them to interact with the system in an open loop mode. So we got like different conditions here. The first was people using the motor priming. The second one, they didn't use the motor priming at all, but they used the same feedback. So again, 3D hands, like with a virtual reality headset, and has a little bit like realistic hands. As a control condition, we use like the conventional arrows that they are pretty much used in the motor imagery paradigm. So you will see that as control, we didn't use like the hands and that specific task, but we use just the arrows. So our idea here was try to see if this specific pre-training in the motor imagery can actually produce better accuracies in terms of the classifiers that we were using, and also if that can create or can reduce the task load or the workload of people during this interaction. So I'm not going through the whole details of the paper, but in a sense, we found a specific increase in terms of the classification. That was not significant, but that was an increase in this specific for this specific condition. And we also found like what was the older one? Like oh yeah, the workload was less when you were involving people with the motor priming. So we managed to reduce the workload of this specific training. The same concepts, can be used in games. So I don't know if you remember this game. It's the dog hunt. So we replicate the dog hunt. I really love that. It's really old school Nintendo. And here the idea was, okay, you can again use the same pipeline, the same paradigm of motor imagery, but then once you activate your imagination of your right hand, you can actually shoot with the right hand revolver or with your left hand revolver. So again, the same pipeline used in this case, instead of like a VR task, you can use it for games. And that was fun, like naturally fun. For this game, we have a challenge, and it can be summarized like, how can we use digital technologies to design and create a game that increases engagement in fitness activities? I was working with a game studio in Portugal, and we started like thinking this stationary bikes. So how can we actually encourage people to get, again, you raise your hand if you have a stationary bike at home. You use it?
No, I just go and ride for real.
That's kind of our scenario. Like a lot of people, they just have stationary bikes at home, but they don't normally use that. And we saw like the flying machine of Da Vinci. So we were like brainstorming around this, and we came out with a very simple game mechanic in which the idea is how can we use like the motion of people while they are like cycling as a way to encourage them to get a target. So this is like the measurement of their movement, and this is the target. And if we are moving the target, we are hoping that people can actually reach this specific target. So we are hoping that people can control their movement by means of persuading them with this specific bar. So yeah, we developed this game. It's a nice prototype, and we embodied people in the flying machine of Da Vinci. And the idea here is we are using mobile virtual reality, and you can just use your mobile phone. And we were using the onboard sensors to compute the no movement, the movement slowly, or the movement fast. So we were just using, this movement while you are pedaling to compute how fast are you moving inside the virtual environment. So people were cycling, and we were like dynamically moving their target. So if they are reaching their target, the points or the objects that they are collecting are going to score in the board. If they are not like reaching that specific target, they are not going to get points. So it's kind of a way to empower people with this very low-cost technology. That was kind of like nice, it's simple, and at the same time, you just need a mobile phone, then download the app, and go to your bike and just make some exercise. So. Again, pretty simple concept, but a little bit powerful. Just to finish the presentation, I will show you some examples of how after making the characterization of some of the systems that we already saw, like the exert Pong or the virtual training for police officers, how we use that specific studies or that models or that physiological data to create the real-time systems that are able or capable to create adaptations in real time based on the physiological signals that we are recording. Sometimes it's quite hard to find inspiration for the games that you are trying to create. But what I really love is to find inspiration in science fiction, specifically in heroes. So, you know, Quicksilver from X-Men is probably one of the funniest scenes in the X-Men, which the guy just stops the time and he's just moving around like freely and everyone is totally frozen. I like that guy. And this is Jean. And she is basically, she has the power of telekinesis. So she can actually move objects just by using the toes. By using this, we connect two different sensors. We empower people with these sensors with these specific superpowers.
Using neuro-Skype to capture your attention levels, focus to enable your partner's ability, giving him the ability to stop objects in time. Using bioplugs to measure your partner's breathing rate, you will need to breathe slowly to enable your ability, giving you the ability to move objects to unreachable places.
So the nice thing with this game is the game is multiplayer, and you as a player has actually the ability to activate your partner's powers. So if you are not good if you are not good with your concentration levels, your partner, which has the time manipulation power, is not going to be able to activate that power because you have to cooperate, you have to collaborate with that. So we made a lot of puzzles in this space shift, and they basically had to collaborate and to merge their superpowers in order to you know, accomplish the goals that we established for them. So that was nice, like how you can promote your self-regulation, physiological self-regulation skills by means of using cooperative and multiplayer games. Interesting concept. Do you remember this game? So it was the game for the Pong. And I will show you how we actually close the loop with this. We use a very simplistic model of collection, analysis, and translation. For the collection, the idea was trying to adapt the system based on the heart rate levels measured in real time for the older adults. So there is a concept called the target heart rate, in which your cardiovascular responses are supposed to be optimal once you are exercising. So if you are actually making exercise, cardiovascular exercise, you will probably have your target heart rate well established based on your gender, age, and other important factors. So we were computing the individual target heart rate levels for people. We were recording signals from smartwatches and also from chest strap sensors. And we were basically averaging that measurements each 30 seconds. So the target heart rate is well established from the American College and from Sports and Medicine. And it seems like for older adults, people should exert between the 40 and 70% of the heart rate reserve, which is the difference between the heart rate maximum and the heart rate during resting. So this is the target state for the older adults. And we were making an analysis like, if this average each 30 seconds is, you know, bigger or smaller than the target, then we will adjust the game difficulty. And for that, we use the ball speed and a proportional controller. So the ball will, each 30 seconds, make an analysis of the heart rate in real time and will increase or decrease the speed based on that specific concept. So we run that experiment, 15 older adults. They were doing conventional exercise versus our physiologically adaptive Exergame. We were doing this in in a senior gymnasium in Madera. And the idea was try to create a more adaptive Exergames for that. So they were like wearing the smartwatch. They were playing the Exergame. They had some feedback in terms of the heart rate responses. And we used these if-then rules to create adaptations in real time. So again, the target heart rate levels are individually set up for each subject. So we compare this against the conventional exercise, the cardiovascular exercise that they carry out at the gym. So, and we compare how the same participants, how were like the cardiovascular responses in terms of heart rate and other physical activity measurements. That we found in this study, you have the heart rate profiles. This is conventional exercise of 15 participants. This is the median, and the shadow, the blue shadow, is the standard deviation. This is the target level. As you can see here, people were a little bit like far away from their individual targets. Actually, we quantified like from the, it was like 20-minute session, how much was the percentage or how many minutes they were actually exerting in their individual target heart rates. And for the conventional, they just got 22% of the exercise time. While in our cardio-adaptive Exergame, they actually exert like more than 60% of the time in their individual target heart rates. So this was a good strategy to push or persuade people to reach their individual target heart rate levels. And after the pilot study, we also run like a more longitudinal study. It was 6 weeks. The same game. In this case, we didn't compare it against conventional, but against the same game without the physiological adaptation. And we also were interested in measuring the cognitive benefits, because once you are doing this cardiovascular exercise, you can also get cognitive improvements, just because your heart is in a better situation and is pumping more oxygenated blood to your brain. So we did a pre and post evaluation, and we found like significant differences in specifically in the processing speed, in the memory, and in an overall or general cognitive status of our patients. So we also found like other cognitive improvements for the game without the physiological adaptation, but I just would like to highlight the specific cognitive domains in which we found differences. So again, this physiological adaptation can also promote or induce cognitive improvements. I think this is probably some of the last systems. And this is something pretty new, and we are still like researching on. But the main idea was, how can we use electromyographic signals to detect muscular fatigue in real time? How can we use this fatigue detection to adapt the system or to adapt the game dynamically? In this specific study, we wanted to compare a non-immersive versus an immersive setup, which means people just seated in front of a flat screen, or people seated using VR head-mounted displays. And we just want to see a couple of specific ergonomic or human factors related with that in terms of muscular fatigue. These are very preliminary results, but that we found here is like the perceived fatigue of people were bigger during the non-immersive condition once compared with immersive. So the immersion can actually reduce the perceived fatigue that people are having during this interaction. Also, the performance in the specific game was better. So people sometimes can be more encouraged to get a better score once they are immersed in this specific game. So the game looks a little bit like engineering. So she's not she's a student from biomedical engineering, and yeah, the game's a little bit ugly, but the concept of the biocybernetic adaptation is quite interesting. Here you have your enemy. It's a very ugly monster. Then you have kind of an initial calibration. We were using the Mayo augment from Talmig Labs. I think the Talmig Labs is done.
Maybe just changed their name. I don't think they've done.
In terms
of Mayo band.
Yeah, in terms of the Mayo augment, I think it's gone. Something like this. Yeah, it's just something I found. So you have the initial calibration. You have to make like you have to execute your maximum effort for that specific moment. The system will know which is kind of your maximum contraction at that moment, and then it will compute frequency parameters. Specifically, for the time, we will compute the root mean square, and for the frequency, we will compute the median of the spectrum. The median value for the spectrum has features to detect fatigue levels. So you will have to basically make the contractions, and if you are actually doing the contractions in one specific percentage of that maximum that you just report in the calibration, you will be able to create a kind of a protection field to reject the attacks. Or if you are actually able to reject and reject a bunch of attacks, you can actually attack back. So again, the idea is to create the adaptation based on the fatigue levels that we are detecting in real time. This was the virtual, there was a kind of an open range for virtual shooting in virtual reality. I was working with kind of like my academic hero back in NASA Langley to try to close this loop. So that specific company licenses some of the patents from this researcher, and they wanted to use those patents to close the loop in this virtual simulator. So we defined a couple of simulation variables, like for instance the size of the targets, or like the weather conditions of the open range. And then we bring police officers and we collect some data from them. So we were using the psychophysiological model that I just showed you to close the loop, to use the concentration and the calmness levels in real time to modify the game variables or the simulation variables in real time. So if they are not well concentrated, if their concentration is not good enough, so you will have the targets moving a lot. So you will have to increase your concentration for that. So it's an open range target shooting. Yeah, in this case, we have like the target speed as well was one of the variables that we were using to modulate the physiological responses, and they were just shooting. So again, if they are not, if they don't have a good concentration, we will modify a couple of game simulation parameters in order to push them for this calm, cool, and concentrated, or calm, cool, and collected state. After actually carrying out all of these like different games and prototypes, I realized that it was quite difficult to, include the physiological signals into the games because the tools are not ready for that. Like the game engine, for instance, if you're using Unity or if you're using Unreal, they are not really friendly for signal processing or signal acquisition or blah, blah, blah. So we have to develop our own tools. So I was developing something that is called the Bio Cybernetic Loop engine, in which we include like several heart rate monitors, chest straps, smartwatches. We also include this is the Affectiva webcam, in which you can extract kind of affective information from the or emotions from users. So we were included a console that, in a sense, you will drag and drop blocks and you will create your logic based on adaptive behaviors. And all of this is made in Unity. So you have actually really fluent communication with the games. So we created a kind of like a library of games that you can use just to, explore and test your different adaptive behaviors, and can be also used for VR. So this is like classic biofeedback in which we were like showing the focus or the calmness level of people. So again, there is a kind of a way to connect the physiological sensing and the physiological adaptation with the games by using these specific tools. And since we were like working also with mobile VR, we also made this framework called Physio VR. And yeah, that was kind of like hard to synchronize different wearable physiological sensors with Android devices and with Android mobile phones, and also connect that with the game engine, in this case, Unity. So we managed to connect smartwatches, the Mayo Armband, and the Muñoz BCI, and we just test the framework with a very simplistic game in which the user is basically lost in a forest, and they have to find the cat. And to find the cat, they will basically have to be like relaxed. They will have to decrease their heart rate levels, and they will start hearing the cat appearing in one of the trees, and they will be able to navigate in that specific place. So again, using physiological signals to create and modulate adaptations in the games. And we developed this framework, and it's available in GitHub, so if you want to get a try for that. They're all like the physiological tools that we have developed. Yeah, what I'm going to try to do in the now working as a postdoc here in Waterloo is I'm going to be mostly involved in these 3 specific projects, working with the VR Exergames for people living with dementia. I'm going to try to see how can we capture fatigue levels of users during the specific rehabilitation protocols, and how can we use this fatigue to create adaptation in a VR or non-VR game. Also, how can we use some social robots to promote intergenerational interaction. Also, like any other project that can, that will show up. And I'm always like to think in this project X, because in my last visit to my country, I had a meeting with some military people and some game studios, and since the conflict in our country is getting to the end, fortunately, and unfortunately we have like a lot of people suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. So our main idea will be trying to build this intelligent agent that we call the PeaceVR, which is going to be basically a physiological enhanced agent able to record data in real time and create adaptation for the exposure therapy in these individuals. So I've made all of those frameworks and games and applications with several people, research lab, game studios, developers, and designers. So many thanks for all of them. They have been like really supportive and really encouraging me to think in different paradigms. And I have been mostly concentrated in the physiological computing, in which I'm supposed to be specialized. And yeah, some of the publications. So I didn't show you like the specific details of the studies and the outcome measures of each specific game, but they are in the publications. He said in the 90s that the psychophysiological training technologies are poised to exploit the revolution in interactive multimedia. I actually hardly and strongly believe that this is going to happen. Probably not now, probably just in a couple of years. But as we saw the Kinect 10 years ago, in general, the full body interaction technology to get born and to be used for a lot of people, I will probably be alive to see this physiological computing to become reality in games and interactive technologies. I think that's pretty much. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, sure.
Just have gas in the tank.
That's a
We'll probably start working here with Jan Boger, with Professor Chi as well, and I will have collaboration with Professor Nang as well in the bionics lab, hopefully.
What are with all the projects that you've been doing, what are some of the hurdles that you've had to come across when working in VR? And I know you explained some of the challenges that you've had, but are there bigger ones that are still out there that you're looking to do for certain projects that are coming up?
Yeah, I have seen some good integration between software and hardware. So far, we have to wire the people with the different sensors that we also measure, and then we put the head-mounted display. Sometimes this is really cumbersome and uncomfortable. What I have been seeing is companies trying to, embed they put on the head-mounted displays the sensors, the electrodes, to be able to measure them without having to put extra sensors. And they are also coupling this with the software. In that specific software, you are not only receiving the raw data, but also features. Sometimes from the raw physiological data to the features is a little bit complicated, especially if you are working in real time. So I don't know if you saw that panel for the electrocardiographic signals in real time. So the detection of the highest peak, the R peaks, is something that is solved decades ago. But once you go to a game engine, which is not friendly for any type of signal processing thing, just this step can take you, weeks or months of developing. So, the game engines are just not ready for the physiological signals, and we are trying to push tools or create tools for that. I like Unity and in general the C# community around is good, but again, once you have to go to very specific transformation, for instance, the Fourier transformation, to work with the Fourier transformation in real time, you go to, Stack Overflow is nice, but once you want to go to very specific detailed things, you will find 10 examples of Fourier transform, but then once you try to apply them to the real-time system, some of them are not working, or you have to re-implement everything. So again, sometimes the real-time systems with physiological sensing used in gaming is still very not totally mature field.
I used to read up a lot on game engines, and I know that Valve was actually creating actual technologies that would use haptic feedback within their game system. So I don't know how detailed they were getting with their source engine, but if they were making technology and also they build their own engine, that also open source it. Have you worked with?
You also have seen the Amazon one. They are trying also to push this game engine, but I never tried something beyond Unity. And you also have this discussion with the Unreal, and a lot of people say, Unreal is better, and blah, blah, but it's just a matter of getting used to the game engine and to start working with. So then I haven't seen, for instance, any example of physiological computing games in Unreal. So I guess I don't know, just because Unity is already spread out, or just because it's more comfortable for it. So, yeah, thank you.
I have a question. So when you were talking about the two different games that you were testing with older adults, the Pong Exergame, and you were comparing it with conventional exercise, did you measure for how it affected motivation at all? Because I know you're talking about cognitive benefits, but how about motivation or willingness to keep exercising?
It was only showing the complete data and the analysis here, but in a sense that we found is not the Exergames alone, but the combination of Exergames and conventional. So we were actually doing this combination, and we were competing against the only conventional exercise. And we noticed that once combined, these Exergames can actually provide a very good levels of motivation and replayability, which are like quite interesting metrics in terms of technology adoption. So yeah, combination is always good, at least for this older adults population in Portugal.
Kind of related to that, did you find older adults had to see a point to the game more than younger adults?
Like, if they found?
So this is something like we've kind of explored and seen in literature, is that for older adults to engage and kind of keep engaging, they have to see a point to the game, you know, whereas younger adults are like, there doesn't have to be a point, it's just a game. Play it. Whereas older adults need like some sort of rationale to why they should be playing.
That was something that was really surprising when we carry out, like, it was like a 2 years user-centered design, trying to match all of the features for those, virtual tour in Portugal Exergames. We noticed that they're very competitive, like very, very, very competitive. Like once they are over there, they are, and they started like, saying like really hard words against the game and like insulting the ball and like getting really angry when they lost a ball or something like this. So we started like adapting our game and trying to reduce the amount of, trying to give them always kind of a small point for something, or like, the rewards being greater than the punishments or something like this. So we were trying to adapt a little bit that score system. And once we were running the longitudinal study, they were actually asking the rest of the participants for their scores. So they were competing their scores in each individual game. Like, for instance, how many liters of wine I produced today? And they were asking to the trainer, like, the amount of wine that the wife was also producing or something like this. So very, very much competitive. Especially I found the males a little bit more competitive than the females.
Did you have a leaderboard?
We had leaderboards for each individual game, but we didn't like share that with the participants. So we thought that would be interesting as a way to create a competition in our 3-month study. But we noticed that might create some frictions and conflicts that we want to just avoid that.
So related, did you do any logs for gender? Like, did you find a difference in gender in how they played games?
Before this, I did like 3 different user personas, and they were very much narrowed for willingness to play Exergames in the senior gymnasium. So they were not gender related. We always have more females participating in our studies than males, and that's kind of a bias of our study. But in terms of willingness, we didn't like find a very, very much specific things.
So, like, physiological though?
Oh yeah, measuring the heart rate with the chest strap with the females is a little bit complicated just for the breast. So.
In terms of actual performance, like, for example, did males' heart rates go up the same sort of way females did? Did women go up faster? Like, target heart rates different, or like elicited heart rates different, or something like that?
We didn't analyze the difference between the genders, but we noticed that some people with some small limitations in terms of mobility, they wouldn't be able to reach their target heart rate just because they are not able to, move as quick as, as the game is demanding. So, yeah, we were like filtering, but at certain point we didn't manage to filter like everything, and we didn't have access to the health recordings, the electro and cardiographies from the patients. So we tried to control a little bit in terms of the medications, but we didn't manage to control as we would like for the controlled studies. Yeah.
Okay, so very nice work, and I'm really happy that we have you on board.
Good.
So, yeah, I think. So, some specific questions. For example, the stroke, the study that you did was motor imagery, right? So,
Yes, sir.
The purpose is to show priming can improve the performance of this particular BCI. So two questions on this. We don't need to play the video.
Oh, sorry, it was automatic.
So the first question is, how do you think this can be applied for a stroke patient?
Normal
people can do this priming, they can do the active movement, while stroke patient they cannot. That's the point, right? So how do you think this priming can be applied in stroke?
Something that we noticed when we were thinking in creating a virtual reality task for the motor imagery paradigm was like at some point you just ask people to imagine the movement, but with the hands you can make like a lot of movements, and we were like actually trying to bring vividness in terms of the imagination by means of using this motor priming. With the stroke patients, that probably will we did it with healthy adults. What I probably will try to do with stroke patients is like see which type of priming I can do with them, like which are the movements that they're capable to do, which are the range of motion that they can get and everything. So I will then try to design a task, a virtual task for that specific limitations.
So how do you know which priming or which movement of priming that would work with stroke patients?
I have seen a couple of studies like doing different priming tasks for them, and to be honest, it's mostly the therapists, like what is the recommendation from the therapist, like which type of exercise are they capable to perform, and then we will try to match it with the design process. So based on the therapist, basically we.
So the second question is related. So what is the benefit specifically that that we should use VR? Can we just show flat screen TV with serve the same purpose?
That's.
When we using BCI, VR is mentioned, you need to wear the headset, interfere with the EEG electrodes, then
You move the electrodes, yeah.
So there's a very clear problem involving VR. Now here, you have to have a very good justification or very clear benefit. Why we're using VR would be helpful here. So what is the reason that we want to use VR?
That we noticed in that experiment in which we compared the flat screen against the immersive. I guess it's in terms of embodiment.
The last one was the Muñoz fatigue, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question on that, but okay.
Okay, but yeah, I might think that with the head-mounted display or older VR setups, you can actually provide a better embodiment or a better feeling of presence, being immersed in that specific virtual scenario that you have, instead of having a flat screen in which you will see the rest of the real world happening around you. So maybe that feeling of being immersed can enhance the realism or the vividness of the interaction. And that might be possible. That might help in some way to improve the interaction with that specific task. So if you are opening the garage here and seeing in a flat screen, probably you will be more, you will feel like a better presence or more immersed once the rest of the things that are surrounding you are virtual. So.
Demonstrating whether or not using VR that you mentioned that
the difficult
enhance the embodiment and things like that. Is there any study on this particular topic that, for example, using VR can improve motor imagery-based BCI that you know of?
I have seen it's called Mel Slater. This is in Barcelona. He is probably the best guy who has been working in presence and embodiment with VR, and he has a really nice. He called it the Embodiment VR Lab, and he has been working with this. The difficulties part is to improve the accuracy of the classifiers.
Yeah, so
That's actually the difficulties part. Like the rest of the human, the game user research, the variables can be probably enhanced.
I understand the motivation where VR can improve embodiment, but then is that enhanced embodiment can improve BCI performance? That's the question mark that I have. We're looking for ways to improve that, various ways.
Yeah.
VR is one of them that we have been exploring, of this not the tip that you have done. So that's a question. I'm not really familiar with that part of the literature. So I was wondering if you know any specific study demonstrating using VR can improve BCI performance. So I guess that's my question.
Yeah.
We can discuss that.
That's a good thing for you to start reading into,
Yeah.
I think, if
Yeah.
it's complementary to the work Jacob showed.
So I guess I didn't have a question. I have a comment on the muscle EMG first.
Yeah.
So if you're using mile band, I can tell you almost 100% sure that how do you call that? The accuracy of measuring fatigue is very limited.
Yeah.
Polite way of putting it.
It's very limited. The bandwidth is too small. You're looking at the lower third of the spectrum for EMG. And what is changing fatigue is really bad, as you mentioned, the median frequency lower shift. So by only looking at a lower third of that, the reliability of detecting that is very limited. We will have better chance using a a research grade EMG system.
Research grade, yeah.
At least sampling in 1K, at least 1K, to have some sort of more reasonable measurement.
What is probably interesting with this type of system, I normally have these kind of comments specifically from the VCI community or the bioengineering community in terms of the wearables. Wearables are always like, we don't really know the accuracy of that. What is interesting with this is the concept itself of the Bio Cybernetic Loop that we are creating for this application can be used for wearables, research grade systems, or any type of system or any type of sensor. So that's kind of the value that we are trying to bring here. If you have a more accurate sensor, just bring me the sensor and we will try to create the same structure in the same game by using a much better sensor.
I fully support the idea of bringing that in, just in terms of the
accuracy, yeah.
specification that you use, this is not going to work.
Yeah. That's also why we didn't wanted to, check the EMG analysis of the signals, because we also noticed that they are not really accurate. But we were mostly interested in, for instance, what was the perceived level of fatigue by using this Bohr scale, or the performance in the game. So we noticed a couple of differences between the immersive and non-immersive VR. This is actually very, you will find a lot of literature pointed out, like VR and VR as well. So now there is a debate in the literature, to try to define what VR is. For some people, VR can be easily in a flat screen in front of. For other people, no, you need the head-mounted display, or either you need the cave, or So this is still something arguable.
So maybe still time for a last question. So you mentioned very early in the very first study, you measured heart rate and heart rate variability. So what do you use for heart rate variability?
So we wanted to see the time, some time domain and frequency domain parameters to see how was the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activating during the specific events.
How successful were you?
Sorry?
How much information you get from HRV?
Oh yeah, we were you are saying for the Exergame.
I forgot which part. I think
Okay, just in general.
Early, yeah. So I mean, we are using HRV, and
Yeah.
To be honest, not so successful. The conclusion that we can obtain from the normal way that you do this high-low frequency ratio, this timing features, they are not giving us too much information, or they're not that accurate as we had hoped, or as we have read in the literature. This is another question.
Yeah.
In general, how successful were you? How accurate? How much information you really can expect in terms?
that what we are doing is actually using heart rate variability to complement the assessment of the cardiovascular patients, like the cardiovascular assessment of older adults. So we are complementing this information with information from the fitness trainers. So they are like giving us, like for instance, the VO2 max and other signals, and we are like, for instance, making like regression models or correlation models as well to see how specific features from the heart rate variability are associated with the cardiovascular performance in assessment. For that, it has been useful to how to integrate real-time heart rate variability measurements to complement the conventional fitness assessment. And we have like created a couple of visualizations for that. But yeah, for other things, it has been pretty complicated. In one of the studies, we actually came out with significant differences for the control condition rather than for the conventional, or for the the experimental condition, the physiologically adaptive. So it was going against the rest of the findings that we have in the study.